Buried beneath layers of official reports, propaganda, and post-war treaties lies a darker record of World War II, a record not printed in textbooks nor spoken of in commemorative speeches. These are the events governments fought to erase, the stories deliberately withheld from public memory. They are fragments of declassified documents, faded photographs, and whispered testimonies long suppressed by intelligence services and political necessity. When read together, they reveal a chilling truth. The victors of war did not always act as liberators, and even allies stained their hands in silence and secrecy. Each file carries the weight of betrayal. Each suppressed chapter, a reminder of how history can be shaped not only by those who win wars, but by those who control the archives afterward. Tonight we open 4 such files, pried loose from locked cabinets and forgotten basements, pieced together from evidence that was never meant to see daylight. These are not tales of battlefield heroism or celebrated triumphs. They are forbidden histories, sealed away for fear of what they might expose about governments, armies, and alliances. What you're about to hear may sound unthinkable, but the documents, signatures, and surviving witnesses insist otherwise. 4 events, concealed for decades, now re-emerge as part of a record that will not stay buried forever. Chapter 1. The Classified Katyn Massacre Files. In the spring of 1940, as Europe stood on the edge of total collapse, thousands of Polish officers, intellectuals, and professionals vanished into the shadows of Soviet custody. These men were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were the carefully selected backbone of the Polish nation. Military leaders, university professors, doctors, priests, judges, engineers, and writers. Taken from internment camps in places like Kozelsk, Ostashkov, and Starobelsk, they were transported under NKVD orders to remote forests and prison basements. What happened next was denied for generations, hidden beneath forged reports and silence from both East and West. Yet the records that have surfaced leave no doubt about the scale of the crime. Signed documents bear the name of Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's feared security chief, recommending execution as a solution to what Moscow called the Polish question. Stalin's approval sealed their fate. One bullet at a time, the officers were led into secluded chambers or wooded clearings, shot in the back of the head, and buried in mass graves. The Katyn forest, near Smolensk, became the most infamous burial ground. But it was not the only one. The massacre was systematic, planned, and calculated to decapitate Poland's leadership in exile. The Germans discovered the graves in 1943 when advancing eastward. Propaganda units quickly publicized the find, hoping to fracture the fragile alliance between Moscow and London. Photographs showed skeletons in rotting uniforms, identification papers still intact, names and ranks clearly visible. The Nazis accused the Soviets directly, but Washington and London, desperate to keep Stalin committed to the war effort, dismissed the evidence as fascist manipulation. Privately, however, Allied diplomats and intelligence officers doubted the Soviet denials. In confidential Foreign Office files stamped "most secret," analysts admitted that the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward the NKVD. Still, official statements were carefully crafted to avoid confrontation. Winston Churchill himself wrote in a restricted memo that though the Soviets had likely carried out the atrocity, we shall never say so publicly. The survivors who attempted to speak out were silenced. Polish officials in exile, stationed in London, demanded an independent investigation under the Red Cross. Their appeals were blocked by both Western allies and Moscow. The Soviet Union responded with fury, breaking relations with the Polish government in exile. Meanwhile, thousands of Polish families waited for fathers and brothers who would never return. Their fate concealed under layers of classified denials. The officers' names were quietly struck from rosters. Files were marked missing or unaccounted for. In classrooms, no trace of them remained. Poland itself, carved into Soviet influence after 1945, was forbidden to speak the word Katyn. The Cold War only deepened the silence. For decades, American administrations, including Roosevelt and later Truman, avoided revisiting the massacre. Declassified CIA cables from the early 1950s reveal that intelligence services held witness reports from German prisoners, Soviet defectors, and even Polish railroad workers who had seen the transports. Yet the reports were locked away, classified as sensitive. The official line remained that the crime could not be conclusively attributed to Moscow. The Soviet Union, for its part, constructed elaborate fabrications. State-controlled newspapers printed stories accusing the Germans of murdering the officers during their 1941 occupation of Smolensk. Evidence was manufactured to match the timeline. In Nuremberg, the Soviet delegation attempted to indict the Nazis for Katyn, though even Allied prosecutors quietly resisted, aware the claim could not withstand scrutiny. For the families, the truth was an open wound. In Polish communities scattered across London, Chicago, and Toronto, whispered stories circulated of relatives who had vanished. Lists of missing officers were smuggled and recopied, passed in secret so that their names would not disappear entirely. Memorial services were banned in communist Poland, where even placing flowers in Katyn's soil risked imprisonment by the secret police. Those who tried were interrogated by the UB, the Ministry of Public Security, and sometimes disappeared themselves. The memory of Katyn became a forbidden act of resistance, preserved in exile but erased within the homeland. It was only in 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that fragments of the truth were finally admitted. Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev handed over partial documents to Polish authorities, acknowledging NKVD responsibility. More files followed, including Beria's chilling order dated March 1940. The numbers were staggering, over 22,000 victims, their names preserved in lists once hidden in Politburo safes. Yet even then, entire folders remained missing, their disappearance suggesting deliberate destruction of evidence. Some Russian archives remain sealed to this day, fueling suspicion that the full extent of the massacre has never been revealed. Questions linger about the orders, about who precisely within the Soviet hierarchy managed the logistics, about the unknown burial sites that still dot the forests of Western Russia. The Katyn massacre was more than a war crime. It was an attempted erasure of a nation's leadership, a premeditated decapitation meant to weaken Poland's ability to resist Soviet domination. The cover-up, aided by silence from the West, ensured that the crime remained hidden for half a century. Families waited in silence. Allies lied through omission, and textbooks erased the truth. Katyn is not just a mass grave in a forest. It is a symbol of how history can be buried with the dead, classified away by the living, and only resurrected when the vaults of secrecy finally crack open. What remains most disturbing is how many powerful governments knew the truth and chose silence, proving that even the most horrifying atrocities can vanish when political survival demands forgetting. Chapter 2: Forbidden Experiments of Unit 731. In the remote plains of occupied Manchuria, hidden beyond the ordinary maps of World War II, stood one of the darkest laboratories of human cruelty ever constructed. Its name was cloaked under an innocent designation: the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But the world would come to know it by another name: Unit 731. Behind barbed wire and high wooden watchtowers, an entire city of death was engineered for one purpose: the weaponization of biology. It was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was a place where prisoners were stripped of their names, reduced to maruta, a word meaning logs, and subjected to experiments so grotesque they remained classified for decades. The Japanese High Command had sanctioned it. General Shiro Ishii designed it, and thousands would vanish inside it, never to emerge alive. The experiments were as methodical as they were inhuman. Men, women, and children, Chinese civilians, Russian prisoners, Korean captives, even Allied POWs, were deliberately infected with diseases like plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. Doctors stood by with clipboards, noting the progression of fevers, convulsions, organ failure, and death. Frostbite studies left prisoners' arms frozen solid in icy basins, only to be shattered with hammers to observe the destruction of flesh and bone. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia, with bodies cut open as researchers examined the impact of infection on organs still pulsing with life. Gas chambers tested chemical weapons. Explosive devices were strapped to unwilling subjects to measure blast patterns. All of it carried out under the cold efficiency of medical procedure, as though science had erased every trace of humanity from the men in white coats. The scale of the project was staggering. Reports later uncovered estimate that over 3,000 prisoners perished inside the compound directly from experiments. Yet when factoring in the deliberate release of pathogens on nearby villages, the death toll stretches into the hundreds of thousands. Entire Chinese communities were wiped out after plague-infested fleas were dropped from low-flying aircraft. Rivers were poisoned with typhoid cultures. These field experiments transformed Manchuria into a living laboratory, where human lives were discarded as easily as broken test tubes. Japanese officers recorded results in meticulous notebooks, coded with terms like Field Trial 23 or Special Experiment 8, creating a body of research unmatched in its cruelty. At war's end, the world might have expected these crimes to face the full judgment of justice. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal seemed the place where Unit 731's horrors would be exposed. But the records tell another story, one of secrecy and betrayal. American occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, quickly realized the potential military value of the research. Files seized from Ishii's headquarters were flown not to a courtroom, but to Fort Detrick, Maryland, home of America's biological warfare program. In exchange, Ishii and his staff were granted immunity. The deal was simple: silence in return for scientific data. None of the perpetrators ever stood trial. Many resumed comfortable lives in Japan, some even becoming prominent in post-war medicine and academia. Meanwhile, victims' families received no acknowledgement, their suffering dismissed as a casualty of classified diplomacy. The official silence stretched for decades. When whispers of Unit 731's existence emerged, Japanese officials denied everything. Survivors who spoke of missing relatives were branded liars. Chinese testimonies were dismissed as communist propaganda. The archives remained sealed, guarded under the justification of national security. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that fragments of truth began to surface. Journalists uncovered hidden files. Former workers, on their deathbeds, confessed to what they had seen. Photographs smuggled out showed human remains, twisted instruments, and notebooks filled with clinical sketches of mutilated bodies. A chilling reality emerged. Not only had the crimes been committed, but powerful nations had ensured they would be forgotten. The complicity of the United States remains one of the most disturbing aspects. Declassified memoranda reveal US military intelligence officers describing Ishii's data as priceless and unique. The ethical implications were set aside in favor of an arms race against the Soviet Union. In an era when both sides feared biological warfare, Unit 731's findings were seen as a shortcut to dominance. Soviet prosecutors attempted to expose the crimes during the 1949 Khabarovsk trials, where Japanese officers confessed under oath. Yet in the West, these testimonies were dismissed as communist show trials. The irony is that the Soviets, despite their own horrific crimes, were the only ones who publicly placed Unit 731 on record, while Washington quietly buried the evidence. For the survivors of the surrounding villages, memory was the only archive. Elderly Chinese peasants described the sudden appearance of plague-carrying fleas, the strange powders dropped from planes, the rivers that turned into death traps. Families buried their loved ones in unmarked graves, never knowing why they had died. In Japan, those few who dared speak of Unit 731 faced ostracism, even threats. The secrecy was so complete that entire generations grew up unaware of the crimes committed in their name. Only through persistent research, lawsuits, and grassroots memorial efforts has the truth gained acknowledgement in recent decades. Even today, debates rage in Japan's parliament over whether to formally admit the atrocities, with nationalist factions pushing to keep the subject buried. The legacy of Unit 731 is one of science perverted into a weapon, truth silenced by political necessity, and victims erased by diplomacy. The laboratories of Harbin are gone now, demolished after the war, but their foundations still whisper of the screams once heard within their walls. Exhibits in Chinese memorial museums display shattered surgical tools and faded photographs, grim reminders of what was hidden for so long. The immunity deal struck by the United States remains a stain on international justice, a precedent that powerful nations may choose knowledge over accountability. For those who perished in the frozen chambers, on operating tables, or in infected villages, justice never came. Their stories linger only in fragments, in classified reports, in confessions extracted too late. Forbidden for decades, their suffering is now too loud to be ignored. A reminder that even in war, some crimes are considered too dangerous to acknowledge. Chapter 3: The Erased Tragedy of Operation Keelhaul. The spring of 1945 was supposed to mark liberation for millions across Europe. Nazi Germany was collapsing, Allied forces were advancing on all fronts, and displaced persons scattered across the continent looked to the West for safety. Among them were Soviet prisoners of war, Cossacks. and civilians who had fled Stalin's brutal purges years earlier. Many had fought alongside German forces. Others had simply tried to escape the famine, repression, and arrests that defined Stalin's regime when they surrendered to British and American forces. They believed they had escaped the grasp of the Soviet Union forever. Instead, they became victims of one of the most suppressed and disturbing episodes of the post-war era, Operation Keelhaul. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin had signed agreements concerning the repatriation of prisoners and displaced persons. Buried within diplomatic language was a grim reality. Every Soviet citizen, regardless of circumstance, was to be returned to Moscow's control. For the Western Allies, the decision was justified as honoring commitments to their Soviet ally. For those caught in its net, it was a death sentence. British and American troops, under direct orders, were tasked with rounding up tens of thousands of men, women, and children. Refugee camps across Italy, Austria, and Germany became holding pens. In the Tyrol region of Austria, Cossack families were told they were being resettled in the West, only to find themselves handed over to Soviet officers waiting with trains and trucks. Eyewitness reports, many buried in restricted files for decades, describe scenes of desperation. In the small Austrian town of Lienz, Cossack leaders were invited to a supposed conference with British commanders. Instead, they were forcibly arrested, bound, and prepared for handover. Their followers, realizing the betrayal, erupted into chaos. Mothers clung to their children, men fought desperately against armed guards, and suicides multiplied. Some hurled themselves into rivers, others leapt from bridges or cliffs rather than face return to Stalin's wrath. Local villagers, stunned by the brutality, later recalled the cries echoing through the valleys. Yet these stories were absent from official records. Reports filed by British officers described voluntary repatriations, language chosen, deliberately to disguise the coercion that had taken place. The Soviet reception for the returnees was swift and merciless. NKVD units, already positioned at transfer points, divided the prisoners into groups. Officers and intellectuals were often executed on the spot. Others were crammed into cattle cars and shipped to Siberian gulags. Families were torn apart, with children separated from parents. Many of those who had fled Stalin during the 1930s knew what awaited them: interrogation, torture, and eventual death in the Arctic labor camps. Western intelligence later confirmed the outcome. Declassified CIA reports from the early 1950s noted that the majority of those repatriated under Operation Keelhaul did not survive more than 5 years. Yet the official silence remained unbroken. The name Keelhaul itself carried a grim irony. It derived from the brutal naval punishment of dragging a sailor beneath the keel of a ship. A slow, suffocating death. The code name suited the operation perfectly. It was conducted between 1945 and 1947, involving British, American, and French forces, with estimates of victims ranging from 2 million to over 3 million people. The operation extended even to individuals who were not Soviet citizens. White Russian émigrés who had fled before the Bolshevik Revolution, or Yugoslav anti-communist fighters. Bound by political agreements, Western forces surrendered them anyway. In the calculus of diplomacy, their lives were expendable. For decades, the operation remained hidden behind classified seals. Documents were filed away in military archives, labeled sensitive or restricted, and historians who inquired were stonewalled. Official war histories produced in Britain and the United States omitted the subject entirely. The victims had no voice. Their communities had been obliterated, their names lost. Only scattered testimonies survived, whispered among survivors in exile communities across South America, North America, and Australia. In some cases, priests who had witnessed forced repatriations recorded secret journals, kept hidden for fear of reprisal. These fragments would later become the only surviving evidence of what had occurred. When the truth began to surface in the 1970s, it caused shock among those who believed Allied conduct had been unblemished. Historians uncovered British Foreign Office files stamped "Most Secret" that described the logistics of the transfers, complete with train schedules and numbers. One chilling memorandum instructed officers to use necessary force to ensure compliance. Another, dated May 1945, warned field commanders that any display of resistance must be suppressed firmly and immediately. These documents revealed not only knowledge of the consequences, but deliberate deception in how the operation was described to the public. Officials knew they were delivering thousands to death, and they chose silence. The tragedy of Operation Keelhaul lies not only in the numbers, but in the betrayal. These men and women had surrendered under the belief that the West represented freedom from totalitarian terror. They had walked willingly into Allied camps, trusting uniforms marked with stars and stripes, with lion insignias, with promises of refuge. Instead, they were bound, loaded onto trucks, and handed to the very regime they had fled. It was not the enemy that destroyed them, but the supposed liberator. For survivors, this betrayal cut deeper than the physical suffering that followed. It was proof that politics had erased morality, that human lives were bargaining chips in a larger game. Today, scattered memorials in Austria and Italy mark the places where these handovers occurred. Stone plaques bear inscriptions honoring those who perished in silence. Yet in official histories, the episode remains little more than a footnote, overshadowed by larger narratives of victory and liberation. Governments remain reluctant to address it directly. In Britain, petitions for formal acknowledgement have been repeatedly ignored. In the United States, the subject rarely enters public discourse. The silence is itself a continuation of the original erasure, as though admitting the truth would tarnish the carefully constructed myth of a purely righteous war. The erased tragedy of Operation Keelhaul reminds us that not all victims of World War II wore enemy uniforms. Some were betrayed by their allies, sacrificed in secret under the cover of treaties and diplomatic necessity. Their cries were smothered under the roar of post-war celebration. Their names vanished from records, their deaths never acknowledged in court. Only the declassified files, the few surviving witnesses, and the haunting memorials in alpine valleys keep their memory alive. The rest was deliberately erased, leaving a scar in history that governments still hesitate to reveal fully. Chapter 4: Hidden Catastrophe of Dresden Bombings. In February 1945, as the war in Europe approached its violent conclusion, the city of Dresden stood largely untouched by the destruction that had leveled so many of Germany's urban centers. Known as the Florence on the Elbe, Dresden was famous for its Baroque architecture, grand opera houses, and art collections, rivaling those of Paris or Vienna. Refugees fleeing the advance of the Red Army poured into the city by the tens of thousands, filling train stations, hospitals, and temporary shelters. They believed Dresden to be safe, a cultural jewel with little military significance, unlikely to be targeted. What happened on the nights of February 13th and 14th shattered that illusion forever and remains one of the most controversial and concealed tragedies of the Second World War. The first wave came in darkness. Shortly after 10 p.m., British Royal Air Force bombers flew in low, releasing high-explosive ordnance designed to rip open rooftops and expose the timber beneath. Minutes later, a second wave followed, this time with incendiary devices that ignited the exposed structures. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming entire blocks. Survivors later described a roar like a hurricane, as flames fed on oxygen and created a firestorm. Asphalt streets melted, pulling victims down like quicksand. Those who sought shelter in basements suffocated as the oxygen was drawn away, while others who fled into open squares were incinerated by the heat. By dawn, the historic core of Dresden had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Yet the bombing was not finished. On February 14th, American 8th Air Force squadrons arrived in daylight, dropping additional explosives onto a city already consumed by fire. Their targets included railway yards, bridges, and industrial areas, but much of their payload fell into residential districts already crowded with refugees. Eyewitnesses spoke of corpses lined along the streets, stacked in heaps, or burned beyond recognition. Contemporary estimates of the dead ranged from 25,000 to over 100,000. Official Allied figures, however, deliberately minimized the scale, insisting on lower numbers to avoid public backlash. Records show that Winston Churchill himself, disturbed by the ferocity of the destruction, ordered a post-war memorandum referring to Dresden as an unnecessary act. That memo was quickly withdrawn, replaced with sanitized language crafted to preserve the image of justifiable military necessity. The cover-up of Dresden began almost immediately. Official communiqué emphasized the city's supposed industrial role, citing its railway hub and munitions factories. But later investigations revealed these claims to be exaggerated. Declassified RAF target maps show primary focus not on specific military facilities, but on the densely populated Altstadt, the old city centre. Files marked secret within the British Air Ministry instructed crews to maximize destruction by creating firestorms, a strategy of total devastation rather than tactical precision. In post-war histories commissioned by Allied governments, Dresden was described as a legitimate operation against German infrastructure. Civilian casualties were mentioned briefly, if at all, and photographs of the ruins were withheld from the public for years. Meanwhile, survivors carried memories too horrific to erase. Nurses at the Johannstadt hospital recorded treating patients whose skin had peeled away in sheets from the heat. Firefighters described entering cellars only to find hundreds of bodies, blackened and fused together. Refugees recounted the sickening smell of burning flesh that lingered for weeks, long after the fires were extinguished. Yet their testimonies were rarely published in the immediate aftermath, censored as part of a broader strategy to control the war's narrative. In both Britain and the United States, newspapers echoed official lines, framing Dresden as a military necessity. To question the bombing was seen as undermining the moral authority of the Allied cause. The Cold War further buried Dresden's story. In the West, it remained an uncomfortable reminder that the liberators of Europe had also unleashed destruction indistinguishable from the atrocities they condemned. In the East, the Soviet Union exploited Dresden as propaganda, presenting it as proof of Western barbarity, while conveniently omitting its own mass deportations and executions. Between these competing narratives, the victims were lost. Their voices were drowned out by politics, their deaths manipulated or erased depending on the needs of each superpower. Entire archives concerning casualty figures and bombing assessments were sealed, labeled restricted, and only released piecemeal decades later. When researchers finally gained access to declassified files in the 1970s and 1980s, the scale of suppression became evident. Air Ministry documents showed deliberate efforts to reduce estimated casualties in official reports. Historians found drafts of speeches in which Allied leaders softened or omitted references to the destruction of cultural landmarks. Even photographs taken by reconnaissance planes after the raids had been locked away, too disturbing to fit the narrative of liberation. What emerged from these documents was not merely the story of a military operation, but of a catastrophe hidden in plain sight, reshaped to protect reputations. For Dresden survivors, the memory was never erased. Annual memorials in the ruined Frauenkirche Square became moments of mourning, and for many years, silent protest. The East German state allowed some recognition but politicized the event to condemn the West. It was not until the 1990s, after reunification, that Germany began to openly confront Dresden's tragedy as both a crime of war and a manipulation of history. By then, many survivors had already passed, taking their unspoken grief with them. The city itself, rebuilt brick by brick, stood as both a symbol of resilience and a reminder of what had been lost to fire and secrecy. The hidden catastrophe of Dresden is not simply a story of bombs and fire. It is a story of how governments rewrite the record, of how civilian suffering can be erased beneath official statements, and of how even victors fear the truth of their actions. Dresden's ruins whisper of lives extinguished, of history burned alongside architecture, and of silence imposed to protect power. It was not just a city destroyed, but a memory buried, until the files began to surface and the voices of survivors broke through the enforced forgetting. The hidden files of World War II leave behind more than stories of blood and fire. They remind us that truth itself can be a casualty of war. Governments fought not only on the battlefield, but in the archives, shaping which memories would survive and which would be erased. In Katyn, a nation's leaders were buried in silence for half a century. In Manchuria, science was twisted into horror, then hidden under the seal of immunity. In Austria, those who had fled tyranny were betrayed by the very allies they trusted. And in Dresden, fire consumed not only a city, but the truth of what had happened there. Each case reveals the same chilling pattern. When crimes were inconvenient, they were covered. When justice threatened alliances, it was delayed or denied. The question lingers, unresolved, like a shadow over the post-war world. How many other files remain locked? How many other tragedies erased in the name of necessity? These 4 stories resurface not to shock but to warn. For as long as governments hold the power to bury their mistakes in sealed folders, history remains vulnerable to manipulation. What else lies waiting, hidden in the vaults, sealed by signatures, stamped with secrecy, waiting for someone to look closely enough to break the silence?